Hi everyone, welcome to Knitting 101 with Debbie. I have been knitting for probably close to 10 years now, and I am almost entirely self-taught with regards to knitting. So what I did in this first few lessons is I put together some of the things at the very beginning when I was first learning how to knit that I wish I had known or I wish somebody had explained to me. So the first lesson and the first thing we're going to talk about is yarn weights. And I remember the first time that I went into a knitting store and I walked around, I had no idea what all the different kinds of yarns and weights and all of that meant. I was looking at colors and softness and what I thought was pretty, and I had no idea how I could incorporate those into a pattern. So hopefully this will help you out a little bit, so the first time that you go into a yarn store, you won't be as confused as I was. So there are 6 different kinds of yarn weights, and some of these have different names you'll find, but these are the most common names for the yarn weights. The first is lace, then fingering, sport, DK, worsted, and bulky. So what I want you to think of is lace is the lightest weight yarn, bulky is the heaviest weight or the thickest type of yarn. And so each one of these is a different weight in between those, and they go from lightest to thickest. All right. And we're going to go through each one of those types of yarn in just a little bit, and I'll show you a pattern and all of those things and give you a little bit more explanation. So what does yarn weight mean? So weight refers to how many strands of yarn are combined. So in this day and age, we use a lot of manufacturing equipment to take the fiber that comes from wool or some of the other elements, and they weave that into yarn strands. And so they combine those strands of yarn to make different weights. So think of it, I know this is a very simplistic example, but think of it as 1-ply toilet paper versus 2-ply toilet paper. So 2-ply is thicker because it's 2 sheets of toilet paper put together. So when you have heavier or thicker yarn, it's just more strands of the same yarn woven together to make that yarn. So worsted weight yarn, for example, is thicker than lace because lace weight yarn is usually just 1 strand of the yarn, while worsted is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 strands. And one thing I will say about manufactured yarn, so the yarn that you get at yarn stores, it's not hand spun or anything like that, is it's not really easy to separate. So I know I've done some cross stitching in the past, and when I get the thread, sometimes I'll separate them out because it will only the pattern will only call for 1 strand of that thread as opposed to all 6 strands. So I do know that that is a thing out there in the crafting world, but recently I found some yarn that I wanted to use for a pattern, and it was worsted weight yarn, so it had about 10 strands to it, and it called for one of the lighter yarns, so only 2 strands. So I tried to separate the strands. I thought, oh, it'll be easy, it'll just be like my thread and my cross stitching patterns. But when I went to do that, it turned into a big old mess, and I ended up wasting a bit of the yarn. So it's really hard to separate. It's easier if you have a pattern that calls for a heavier yarn and you combine 2 of the lighter yarns together. But we'll talk about that later too. Okay, so lace weight yarn, that was the first one, is the finest yarn. So think of garments that are really lightweight, so shawls and scarves and maybe a shrug that you put over a nice dress, something along those lines. So it's very, very thin yarn, and it's used to make very delicate garments and other articles of clothing, hats, think lace doilies. A lot of people crochet with lace weight yarn and make doilies for their, to put on the table or as a placemat or something along those lines. So it's a very, very fine, lightweight yarn. So it won't have a lot of warmth to it, but it's very, very pretty and delicate. But also you have to remember that because it is so fine, you'll knit about 10 stitches per inch. So of all of the yarns, when you are putting together a pattern, just know that lace, if you use lace weight yarn, it's going to take you the longest because you're going to have to do many more stitches than if you used a heavier yarn. So it'll just take you a bit longer. Just keep that in mind. Fingering yarn is also known as sock yarn. So think, that lightweight yarn that is used to make socks, make homemade socks. It's definitely a lighter weight yarn. It's also used again for shrugs, really light sweaters, shawls, that sort of thing. But again, think spring or maybe early summer type garments that you would wear that maybe you just want a little bit of coverage but not a lot of warmth to it. Again, sock weight yarn is about 8 stitches an inch. So again, it's going to take you a while to knit a project. I mean, if you were going to do a cardigan or a duster, maybe one that goes all the way to your knees, that's like an open cardigan, it would take you a really long time if you used this weight yarn, because 8 stitches per inch, that's a lot of stitches. The next one is sport. A lot of people think that this is athletic, but it's really not. Think sport weight. Think active wear. So you want something that's got maybe a little bit of warmth to it, but is definitely lighter weight. So sport weight yarn is most often used to create baby clothes and baby blankets. You don't have to, but when you're in a yarn store and they have the baby yarn section, which has got the softest and the cutest colors, all of that, just know that most of that is going to be sport weight yarn because it's very, very lightweight. So it's very light on the baby, but it's got a little bit more warmth to it. I'm not saying you can't use sport weight yarn to make a cardigan or a sweater or a scarf. I'm just saying that most commonly it's used for baby clothes and baby blankets. It's about 6 to 8 stitches per inch. So again, there's a lot of stitches there. It'll take you a little bit longer to knit a project with this weight of yarn. The next one is DK, and I actually had to look up what DK was because I've always just said DK and I didn't know exactly what DK stood for, and it stood for double knitting. Way back when people were first knitting, they didn't have the manufacturing equipment that created the yarn today. And so most of the yarn was hand spun. So if you've ever seen hand spun yarn, that's actually my favorite type of yarn. It's a little bit thicker. Sometimes, it's thicker in spots. It's, it's not uniform. And I really like to create hats and very unique scarves with hand spun yarn. But I digress. That's not the point of DK. What it is way back when they would hand spin their yarn, and it was a little bit thicker. Sometimes when they were creating those sweaters that they needed in like the deep dark of winter where it needed to be warm without being too heavy, they would put 2 strands of hand spun yarn together, and they called it double knitting weight and eventually abbreviated it to DK. So again, we're getting into the warmer, a little bit heavier yarn, but it's not quite so heavy and not like super warm. But they did use the double knitting or DK weight way back when. So this is still one that exists today. It's a lot of times DK and worsted are in the same section together because they're really close in weight, but just keep in mind that they are just a little bit different. You'll get about 6 stitches per inch. They use DK weight for a lot of sweaters, hats, scarves, things that need to be warmer without being too heavy. Worsted is the most common type of yarn used for any project. Hats, scarves, blankets, cardigan sweaters, anything that you're going to make. Most often, worsted weight is the most common yarn. If I were to look through all of the yarn that I have for all of my projects, I would say probably 75 to 80% of it is worsted weight, just because it really is the most common. It's still pretty lightweight without being, but it's warm, so it doesn't get too heavy depending on the style of yarn, but it doesn't get too heavy. Now, don't think worst as in bad. Worsted actually is manufactured or was created in Worsted, England, and so that's why we call it worsted yarn. You'll get about 5 stitches per inch, so now we're getting into the, okay, I could get a project done pretty quickly with worsted weight yarn. You'll also be able to see your stitches pretty well, and it's just a really good all-around basic yarn. And when you go into a yarn store, worsted is probably the bulk of the yarn in a yarn store is worsted. And the last one is bulky. There's also super bulky and jumbo, I think is another name. This is the best one for beginners because your patterns will come together very quickly. So you won't get into that shawl stall. That's what I call it, when you're just knitting something forever and you're like, oh, please let this stop. But also it allows you to see your stitches really well because the yarn is much thicker. So you can see your stitches and you can see what they look like, and it's just really good for learning how to knit. So if you're going to be starting, I would choose a bulky weight yarn. Now, when you're looking at this sweater, the sweater just looks magnificent, by the way, for the winter that is coming. It also looks really soft. The thing about bulky that you need to remember is if you're creating a sweater like this, you need to make sure that the yarn is a bulky weight, but it's also pretty lightweight. Because if you were to create this in a really heavy yarn, it would hang on you. And sometimes that would just be a little bit too much, especially if you're up moving around and, you know, doing things around the house or working at the library. You don't want something that's hanging on you that's really heavy. Okay, and you get about 2 to 3 stitches per inch. So again, projects come together really quick. The first few scarves that I created, because that's the best project to start on, is a scarf, came together real fast using bulky yarn. Okay, so the last slide that, or the last bit I was going to talk to you about is just some general tips for choosing yarn when you walk into a yarn store. Go to a store, feel the yarn. Okay, I can't tell you how many times that I've, you know, looked online and I've thought, oh, there's this pattern and it comes with the yarn. And so they send you this whole kit, and then I would get the yarn and I would feel it and I'd be like, oh, this is kind of scratchy, or I don't really like how this feels. And if I make a sweater with this yarn, it's just not gonna, I'm not gonna wear it because it's just not gonna feel good next to my skin. So I always recommend go to the store, feel the yarn. Okay, and there is such a thing as yarn that is too soft. I had this sweater that I was making and I found this really soft silky yarn, beautiful color. I made the sweater out of it and it just drooped because it didn't hold its shape. So you definitely want to look for that balance between soft, yet it is going to hold its shape. Okay, so just make sure that you are choosing a yarn that you like, the color you like and all of that, but at the same time that it's not too soft. Sometimes you can tell, sometimes if they're made just out of silk, something along those lines, it just won't hold its shape very well. A couple more things. If you like a yarn, you find it in the color that you want, but it's not the right weight, either look for it online or ask the people at the yarn store. The people at the yarn store are passionate about yarn. They know a lot about it. They know a lot about knitting, crocheting, all of that, and they'll be able to help you. Most of the time when companies create a yarn in a specific color, they create it in all different kinds of weight, so that you can find that color or something super close to it in any weight. So just ask if it's not out there on the shelf. The other thing that you can do, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, is if you have a pattern that calls for worsted weight, you could take 2 skeins of DK, which is a thinner weight yarn, and put them together. And when you knit, you put take 2 strands and you're knitting 2 strands of that together to equal worsted weight. That's one of my favorite things to do because I can take 2 different colors. I can take 2 similar colors and it has kind of a marbled look to it. The other thing that I love to do is I'll take a strand of maybe my favorite pink or purple or whatever it is, and then a strand that's got some glitter in it, some glittery sparkles. And then I knit those together, and then I've just got this light sparkle in my, sweater, my hat, my scarf. And that's just one of my favorite things to do. So it's easier to combine smaller or thinner strands together to make a pattern than it is to separate a heavier yarn. So just keep that in mind. All right, so if you have any questions, you can come see me at the library and I will be happy to answer them for you. You can also call the library and see if I'm there, leave me a message and I'll call you back, or just send me an email and I'll be happy to answer your questions. My email is debbieb@communitylibrary.net. All right, I hope you have a great day and a great week, and happy yarning, everyone. Bye.